I got a text yesterday to my assistant from Pastor Dave. He's trying to figure out, what do you want me to speak on? And he goes, man, I'm in Jordan, which number one is pretty awesome. He goes, number two, just speak on something related to apologetics and the scriptures. I'm like, okay, that's pretty broad, right? So I started thinking about what kind of the timing of the year, what might be going through your mind. Even got here this morning wrestling with it. And it just hit me. Last night, my wife and I were talking about, like, even growing up in California, I can't remember a time where there was so much rain. Not just quantity. I don't know how much quantity, but just day after day for like the past 2 to 3 months. And I looked this week, it's like 5 out of 9 days it's supposed to rain. Now, if you're from Seattle, you're thinking that means 4. It's not. This is a great week, but we don't live in Seattle. We're not used to this. Now, when we're in a season where it's raining so much, you start to feel like, gosh, am I ever going to come out of this? This is just happening for a long time. You know, today is March 3rd. In 2.5 weeks, it's officially spring. It might not feel like it. It's still like 50s sometimes, but spring is coming. You know, sometimes we get in these seasons in life, whether it's actually the season around us or a life season, where it just feels like this has gone longer than we thought. Like, isn't spring supposed to come? Not only just a physical season, but a life season. You start to wonder, is this ever going to end? Is God silent? Am I coming out of this? Haven't I learned my lesson? What's fascinating is when Christianity came on the scene officially, there was a view of history that there was, say, life, burial, and death. And it was tied to the seasons. So fall and winter would represent death. All the plants and life dies. And then spring is resurrection. And the pagan worldview, time was cyclical. It went on season after season endlessly. But Christianity comes on the scene and says, no, actually, death and rebirth of the seasons are just a sign that God enters history, actually dies, and is reborn, transforming everything. In other words, Christianity said, history is actually meaningful. It points towards something where God breaks into history and changes everything. You see, the resurrection is either the most wicked, vicious hoax foisted upon mankind, or it's the single most important event in world history. Everything quite literally depends upon the question of resurrection. So given that we're in this season, let's enjoy the rain while we can. But in the back of our minds have this recognition that spring is coming. Jesus has resurrected, and that can transform the way we experience the present. Now, I was sitting in a coffee shop not long ago, just kind of minding my own business, studying, working, reading something, and I looked across the table, probably about as far as you are about from me. There's kind of a coffee table in the middle of me and this lady, and she had this yellow book that had silver, like, bold letters going across it, and the title was, God is Not Great. Now, this was from the New York Times best-selling author who passed away about 5 years ago, the atheist Christopher Hitchens. One of the more influential atheists of the past half century. He had really cool hair and a cool accent. And he wrote this book called God is Not Great. And by the way, the subtitle is How Religion Poisons Everything. So this lady really close to me is reading this book, holding it up, and I don't know about you, but there's no way I can be that near to somebody reading such a provocative book and at least not engage that person in conversation. I'm not looking for a fight, but you got to assume this person has opinions and maybe wants to have an interesting conversation. So I kind of leaned in and I said, hey, that looks like an interesting book. What's that about? Well, have you ever asked somebody a question and then 15 minutes later they're still talking and you're thinking, why did I open my stupid mouth? Well, she goes, oh, this book. And she kind of lit up like, this is a really good book. Like, what is it about? And she said, well, it just shows that religion has been nothing since the dawn of existence, but just the bane of bigotry and intolerance and wars and division. She goes, and it also shows that science has disproven God. We know there's not virgin births and resurrections. And she's going on and on. I finally said, well, what does it say about Jesus, if anything? And she goes, oh, this is one of the most interesting parts. She kind of paused and said, think of the nicest person you know. Well, my late grandmother's image comes to mind because she's just frankly one of the sweetest people who has ever lived. And she goes, you have that person in mind? I said, yes. She said, Jesus was just like this person. Was the Son of God, didn't perform miracles, wasn't born a virgin, didn't resurrect. He was just a really, really nice guy. And I paused, and I can only think of one question to ask. I said, if Jesus was just a nice guy, then why did they crucify him? I mean, even the Romans wouldn't crucify Mr. Rogers. Right? Like, honestly, can you imagine the Romans going, gosh, we have this guy Jesus, he's a troublemaker. I mean, after all, he picks up sheep, he tells stories, he talks to kids. He's making us look like a bunch of old grumpy mean guys. Let's torture him to death and make a point about niceness. I mean, honestly, there's some good objections to the faith you and I have to take seriously. That's not one of them. Jesus wasn't put to death for being nice. I mean, frankly, that's just a dumb thing to say, right? There's good objections and bad objections. That's a bad objection. Jesus was put to death not directly for what he did, but for who he claimed to be. Now, what he did all supported who he claimed to be. See, of all the great religious figures that have lived, and by great I just mean influential, Jesus uniquely claimed to be God in human flesh. See, other leaders would say, here's how you get to truth, or here's how you get to God, or some spiritual salvation or enlightenment. Jesus said, I am the truth. I am Yahweh, God in human flesh. Before Abraham was born, I am. And he did supernatural miracles to back it up, namely the resurrection. So in the season we're in right now, whether it's in life or whether it's the weather season, sometimes it feels like this season just might keep going and we're not going to get sunshine. But amazingly, God is in control. And he shows this by the death and resurrection of his Son. Now we're going to look at some of the simple evidence that this is actually true. But beforehand, you realize that if Jesus actually rose from the grave, this answers 3 of the biggest questions people have about life. So since the dawn of mankind, people have been asking and writing, reflecting on big questions. One of them is, does God exist? Is there a supernatural force outside of this world that brought us into existence that we can know in some fashion? Is there a God? Well, if Jesus rose from the grave, I actually think we can answer that a question in the affirmative. How could I say such a thing? So my Ford Fusion is parked on the street, right? I think it's out there. I have no sense of direction. I'm pretty sure it's that way. If we walk outside and there's a huge dent in my Ford Fusion, I stopped. I'm like, what happened? And I picked on him the first 2 services. Pastor Martin says, I saw the whole thing, McDowell. I say, what happens? He goes, I couldn't stop it. I tried. But I saw it. I looked out. And coming down from the sky was this feather. It floated at the top of your Ford and damaged it. Now, none of you would believe that because it's a Ford. If it was a Chevy, you might. Oh, now I'm not going to listen. He's stepping on toes. This just got personal. Now, it doesn't matter what kind of car it was. You wouldn't buy that story. Because an effect, such as a damaged car with plastic and metal, whatever it is, could not have been caused by something such as a feather. If you're going to explain a phenomena, you have to have a sufficient cause. Maybe it was a sledgehammer. Maybe something fell on it. A feather wouldn't do it. Well, if you look at somebody 2,000 years ago who says, I predict that I'm going to be put to death, buried in the ground, and 3 days later I'm coming back from the grave, whatever this causes must have power over life and death. By the way, now, 2,000 years later, with all our technology and knowledge, we can't even figure that out. Whatever rose Jesus from the dead, if it happened, must be very powerful and very smart. And Jesus actually gives us a hint that his Father would raise him from the dead. I teach apologetics at Biola University. Apologetics is not saying you're sorry. It's given a reason for why we believe as we believe. There's very good evidence God exists. For example, we know the universe had a beginning. If it had a beginning, there must be a cause outside of the universe to bring it into existence. The beginning of the universe points towards a beginner. We also know there's certain laws of physics and cosmology that are exquisitely fine-tuned to allow life. Their fine-tuning points towards a fine-tuner. We also look in the cell and we see an exquisite amount of information which points beyond itself to an author of life. The existence of an objective moral law, which we all know and believe in, points to a moral law giver. What I'm highlighting is all these different kinds of arguments that philosophers and apologists can put forward saying that God exists. But if Jesus rose from the grave, that answers the question in the affirmative that God is real. The second question people ask is which religion is true? There seems to be an endless number of religions. How would we know which one to pick? Well, think about it. If God stepped into mankind, lived a sinless life, performed miracles, predicted his death and resurrection, and then actually did it, wouldn't that be God's stamp of approval, so to speak, on the religion that makes that claim? It's kind of obvious when you ask it that way. Jesus uniquely claimed to be God in human flesh, and he said when people asked him for a sign, I will give you the sign of Jonah, 3 days and 3 nights. By the way, Romans 1:4 basically tells us that Jesus is God, and this is confirmed by his resurrection. On the flip side, 1 Corinthians 15:14 and 17 says, if Jesus is not risen, our faith is what? It's in vain. It's worthless. You and I are to be pitied. If Jesus didn't rise, Christianity is false. If he did, Christianity is true. So we can know if there's a God if Jesus rose from the grave. And second, we can actually know which religion is true. Third, we know that there's life after death. That when you breathe your last breath, your conscious life continues. Now, how does the resurrection help us with this? Do any of you remember the 90 or 91 movie Flatliners? How many of you remember this and are willing to admit it in church? Let me see your hands. Put them up, you sinners. Now, this is a movie. Who was in it, by the way? Do you remember? Kevin Bacon. Kiefer Sutherland. Julia Roberts. And Oliver Platt. Now, they're in like their mid-20s or so, because this is early 90s, and they're medical students. And they start to ask themselves the question, do you think there's really life after death? Now, typically, when people want to know the answer to that question, they study philosophy and religion. But they're medical students. Do you know where the name of the movie Flatliners comes from? They take turns flatlining each other's hearts, so they're medically dead, and then they resuscitate him back to life and ask him, what'd you see on the other side? Now, clearly, this is a morbid experiment nobody should try at home. But the thinking actually makes sense, doesn't it? If you want to know what happens after death, talk to someone who's been there and who can come back and tell us about it. Well, in the movie, they go 30 seconds, then a minute, 2 minutes, and they get towards like that 4 or 5 minute barrier where you become brain dead and it's kind of irreversible damage is done. Well, what happens in the movie is not even that interesting or relevant. What's interesting is what they do to find out what's on the other side. You know, in Jesus' Last Supper speech with his apostles, recorded in really John kind of 14 through 16 or so into 17, you know what he says? He says, referring to his death, I'm going to prepare a place for you with my Father. And then he dies and he comes back. Friends, if the resurrection story is true, there is life after death. This life is not all that there is. So if this story is true, it answers three of the biggest questions humans have always asked. Is there a God? Which religion is true, if any? And is there a life after death? But the moment we start to advance evidence for the resurrection, what people think, whether they realize or not, is they'll have a barrier. Many people in our modern Western culture that will filter this and assume that it's not true. It's the barrier of something we call naturalism. Naturalism is a worldview, a belief system, very dominant in the world in which we live. You'll see it in the university, educational system, Hollywood, media, etc. That basically says every phenomena can be explained by natural forces in motion. Supernatural things are not real. So demon possession isn't real. It's really somebody has just some chemical imbalance. The soul does not exist. You really are just a brain. So this naturalistic worldview kind of rules out anything supernatural. Now here's how this happens in practice. So I teach at Biola University's theological school called Talbot School of Theology. I still teach high school part-time at a private school in San Juan Capistrano where my kids go. 3 mornings a week I teach Bible. And a number of years ago I got together with a friend of mine by the name of Brett Kunkel and said, you need to help me take our students to the most godless, secular place you can think of. I got tired of my students graduating, going to the university and having their faith picked apart by either their friends or some secular professor. So let's take our students to the most godless, secular place we can think of, bring in atheists, agnostics, let them speak to our students, but train our students how to defend their faith lovingly. So this next spring, we're going to be taking about 25 or 30 high school students to Berkeley. We've actually done this trip about 5 or 6 times, and the students love it. And a few years ago, we went, and we had, 25 high school students or so, and we interacted with this student atheist group at Berkeley. And when it was done, a couple of them asked me, they said, hey, you mentioned you're coming back in a couple weeks for something different. Can we get together, have coffee, and continue the conversation? I was like, yes. So I came back, and we were on the grass outside of where Sproul Plaza is. If you've ever been to Berkeley's campus, it's kind of the center, the heart of UC Berkeley. And one was a math student at Berkeley. The other one was a PhD physics student, interestingly enough. Never forget, I was talking with the math student. The physics student walks over and kind of interrupts us and goes, okay, wait a minute. So you believe in resurrection, right? I was like, yeah, that's kind of the heart of the Christian faith. He goes, how can you believe in a resurrection when science says when people die, they stay dead? Now, you don't have to answer out loud, but how would you respond to that? So think about, in his mind, he's studying science at Berkeley from some of the smartest people on the planet. Science has given us communications and healthcare and transportation versus a story 2,000 years ago that sounds mythological. Do you see the tension in his mind? So why should I give up everything science has given us to believe this myth? If to believe this story, I have to reject everything I know is true, that's a price too high. This is how naturalism shapes the way people think. And I said, you're right in the sense that science shows that when people die, they stay dead. I said, in fact, we don't really need science to tell us this. It's obvious. But the claim of resurrection is not that somebody rose naturally. The claim is that Jesus rose supernaturally. That's not a contradiction of science. If there is a God who spoke us into existence and made the universe orderly and made life from non-life, then clearly this same God could raise his son from the dead if this God wanted to. It wouldn't violate science. In fact, a raising from the dead would only make sense and be significant if this is what normally didn't happen, right? I said, now here's the difference between me and you. You assume that resurrections can't happen, and then you want to look at the evidence. It's kind of like you're saying, I've already made up my mind. Now let's see how we can discount the evidence. I actually am willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads. If the evidence shows Jesus didn't rise from the grave, fine. But if it shows he did, I'm going to follow it. Don't you see how you're closed-minded and I'm actually open-minded to the evidence? Isn't that an ironic twist of fate? But here's actually what's going on. So this summer I was up in the Sequoia National Forest outside of like Fresno, east of Fresno, if you've ever been up there, and I learned that redwood trees are the tallest. Sequoias are the biggest by volume. And what's believed to be the biggest tree that has ever existed is up in Sequoia National Park. It's been cut down and the stump exists. Imagine 18 men holding hands surrounding the base of this is what it takes just to get to the stump of this tree. Well, it was discovered by some explorers in the late 1800s. So they went back to the Midwest, told all their friends about it, and they wouldn't believe them because they had the idea in their minds that no trees can be that big. So they went back in the late 1800s and cut down the largest tree that has ever existed, sadly, to make a point. They cut it down like a pie, shipped the logs to the World Fair in 1897, reconstructed a huge portion of it to show people empirically, but still people refuse to believe. Google it. You don't believe me? Google the Great California Hoax, and this will come up. Now, why didn't people believe them? Was it a lack of testimony? No. Was it a lack of empirical evidence? No. It was their belief system that started with the assumption trees cannot be this big, so they dismissed evidence to the contrary. I told this kid at Berkeley, I said, if you begin with the assumption God doesn't exist and God doesn't work miracles and everything has a natural explanation, there is nothing I can do to convince you that Christianity is true and Jesus rose from the grave. But if God does exist, why wouldn't you be willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads? Why begin an investigation with your mind already made up? Now that said, what's very interesting is there's more than this, but there's at least 4 minimal facts. I'm going to give you actually 3 of them to keep it simple, that virtually all historians agree on around the life of Jesus. The question is, what fact best explains him? The first fact that's agreed upon is that Jesus died by crucifixion. You realize how strong the evidence is for this, that Jesus died by crucifixion? So what's the evidence he died by crucifixion? Well, one piece of evidence, interestingly enough, is the medical evidence. You say medical evidence? How could they have medical evidence for something 2,000 years ago? In 1986, a historian, a theologian, and a medical doctor wrote a paper in the Journal for the American Medical Association, one of the premier journals in the world. You can actually Google it and find it online. The entire journal is like copied there. It's called On the Physical Death of Jesus. And they examined the accounts of how somebody would die by crucifixion, asking the question, is there medical evidence Jesus was actually dead? So they walked through the way that he was actually whipped, and this wasn't an Indiana Jones whip. It's like a cat of nine tails that would go up like this and have multiple strands with bone and wood embedded to rip and tear the flesh out of your back. That kind of whipping is akin to like a 3rd-degree burn on half your body. The kind of crown of thorns slammed on his head, the robe that would allow the blood to coagulate, and then they would tear it off. Nails in the hands and the feet. Put up. Now, many people would be on the cross 2 to 3 days just slowly wasting away. You didn't die from blood loss. You die from asphyxiation, which is why when you're up on the cross, you realize to breathe, you would have to push up on the nails in your feet and hands to be able to breathe. Talk about pain. In fact, you realize crucifixion was scientifically designed to cause maximal humiliation and maximal pain. Do you know what word in the Latin actually means out of the cross? Does anybody know? Excruciating. Excruciating means out of the cross. So next time you stub your toe, use a different word. What would happen is when they want to speed up death, they'd come and they'd shatter the shins. Because when your body is weighing and you can't push up, you can't get enough air. Eventually, somebody would asphyxiate. Well, they discovered that when somebody dies this way, this watery type fluid surrounds the heart. So somebody died of asphyxiation and was hit with a spear in the side and it went near that area. Guess what would come out? Blood and water. John reports this in John 19. He didn't know scientifically or medically what he was reporting. Luke was a doctor. For years in church history, church historians describe this passage metaphorically. Well, the blood means death, the water means baptism. They add all these spiritual implications. 2,000 years later, scientists are like, actually, John was just reporting what he saw, but he could only report this if Jesus was actually dead. Now, medical evidence aside, you realize we have 4 Gospels in the century in which Jesus lived. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John reporting that he died. The first biography of Alexander the Great is 3 to 4 centuries removed. We have other Christian documents, and we have Josephus, a Jewish writer, Tacitus, a Roman writer, early 2nd century, all confirming that Jesus died by crucifixion. Friends, there's no good reason to believe that Jesus survived. By the way, even if he did, how on earth would he have started the Christian faith? Can you imagine? Even David Strauss, a skeptic, pointed this out in the 19th century. He said, imagine Jesus somehow survived. He takes the 75 pounds plus spices and ointments off him. He stands up, which doesn't make sense given what happened to his body, moves the 1.5 ton stone out of the way, beats up the Roman guards, gets to his disciples without any medical care and says, hey, I've been risen from the dead. Believe in me and you can have a resurrection body like mine. What are they actually going to say? This dude needs a doctor. No chance I'll believe in him. So we know Jesus was dead. Second, the tomb of Jesus was empty. You realize that? There's at least 20 plus arguments that the tomb of Jesus was empty. Now, I'm not going to go through all of them. One class I teach at Biola is a 3-day class on the resurrection. We spend hours walking through all these. I'm just telling you that because there's so much more depth. I'm kind of highlighting it for you. So if you're like, I want to get more depth, come study with me at Biola. I'm not kidding. We'll train you in this. But here's 3 that are compelling me the tomb was empty. All 4 Gospels report that who discovered the empty tomb? The women did, right? Including Mary, or some Marys. You've probably read this 100 times. Do you know why this is significant? This was a patriarchal culture in which a woman's testimony was not considered as significant as a man's. In fact, the more important an event was, the least likely they would rely upon a woman's testimony. So if you're the apostles and you're inventing a story based upon a death, burial, empty tomb, and resurrection, trying to convince people it's true, who's the least likely people you would invent as the first witnesses to the empty tomb? The women. It makes no sense. The fact that all Gospels report this really makes sense if, in fact, this is what the apostles believed happened. Second, in what city was Jesus crucified, by the way? This is the participatory part of the program. You know this one. What city? Jerusalem. You got it. Now, if this story wasn't true, Jesus wasn't crucified, wasn't buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, where would be the hardest city in the world to come preach a death, burial, resurrection, and appearances of Jesus? What city would be the hardest to pull off this hoax? Jerusalem. They'd go to Africa, Latin America, Australia, China, Texas. They go somewhere else. But what do? They march right back to Jerusalem. And if you read the speeches in Acts when the church is beginning, you know what they say? Speaking to the crowd that's listening, they say, you killed Jesus, this prophet of God. He was buried, rose on the third day, and you know that this is true. You know why they went to Jerusalem? Because they knew the body was gone and the tomb was empty. Third reason, what's interesting, you tell me, the first skeptical explanation for the resurrection was what? What happened to the body? It's not just someone stole it, but the disciples stole it. Now, that's okay. I meant what you knew, okay? Disciples stole the body. Now, if you're trying to explain away a resurrection and you say the disciples stole the body, the disciples stealing the body assumes what about the tomb? It was empty. The body was gone. Now, we'll talk in a minute whether the disciples could or would do this. But if the first explanation is that disciples stole the body, that assumes the body's gone and the tomb was empty. Friends, Jesus was dead. Medical evidence. We also have evidence from Jews and Christians and Romans. We know the tomb is empty. He appeared to women. They go right back to Jerusalem, and the first explanation assumes the tomb is empty. Third, Jesus appeared to people after his death. Now, I'll tell you something that's kind of amazing to me. Is I didn't realize this until I really looked into resurrection studies. You realize the vast majority of scholars, and these are not just Christian scholars, agree that the apostles had experiences in which they believed were of the risen Jesus. Now, we'll say it wasn't really of Jesus, but we have to concede that the apostles had experiences that they believed were of the risen Jesus. Now, why would they say this? For one, we have so many different appearances. You have the appearance to the women. You have the appearance to the disciples minus Thomas. The appearance to the disciples with Thomas. You have the appearance to skeptics. You have the appearance to the 500. In fact, a friend of mine was like, why didn't Jesus show up and appear to people who didn't believe in him? I said, he did. Saul wasn't believing in him. He was persecuting Christians. And what's amazing is skeptics will concede that Paul had an experience that he believed was of the risen Jesus. They don't doubt that. So if Paul didn't see the risen Jesus, you have to come up with some other explanation that better accounts for his transformation than the gospel record, right? Or the record in Acts. So in fact, in the book More Than a Carpenter, my dad and I updated together, we include this story. I won't give you all the details, but there was a debate years ago, college campus, professor who's an atheist and agnostic and just known for being really aggressive against Christians, hated Christianity. Not only thought it was false, thought it was evil. And he was debating a Christian apologist at a fraternity. And the Christian apologist raised the argument, what about Saul? How do you explain away this conversion? And the guy says, look, sometimes somebody can be so against a movement, they hate it so much, like Paul did, they end up embracing it. He goes, sir, you better be careful. You're about to become a Christian. And the debate was over. People say schizophrenia, they'll give all these explanations, but none can account for all the facts that we have. What about doubting Thomas? In fact, Thomas wasn't a doubter, and we need to stop calling him a doubter. Because when we call him that, we imply that doubt is incompatible with belief, but that's not true. James says, have mercy on those who believe. Doubt's not the opposite of belief. Unbelief is the opposite of belief. Thomas wasn't like, well, I kind of believe, but I doubt. He was like, I won't believe. He was a skeptic. Totally rejected it until he saw Jesus with his own eyes. He wasn't a doubter. He was a rejecter. If that wasn't a word, it is now. What about James, the brother of Jesus? Mark 3 and John 7. His family thinks he's nuts. They don't believe in him. James has an appearance of the risen Jesus, recorded in 1 Corinthians 15, becomes a follower. Friends, there are certain facts that almost everybody agrees on. Jesus died, tomb is empty. And all these people have experiences they believed were of the risen Jesus. It transformed their life and launched the church. If you don't accept the biblical record, you have to give a better explanation. You know what one of the most common explanation is? The apostles saw hallucinations. They didn't really see Jesus. They had hallucinations. Well, if they had hallucinations, then the body would still be in the tomb, right? So that wouldn't account for any of the data for the empty tomb. But nevertheless, let's ask the question, could the appearances have been hallucinations? Now, here's a big problem for hallucinations. Hallucinations do not appear to groups. You cannot have a group hallucination. You cannot share a hallucination with somebody because they're subjective projections of the mind any more than you can share a dream with somebody. Can you imagine if Inception was true and you could actually share a dream with somebody, how much money you could save? Honey, we don't need to go to Hawaii. Go to sleep. We are on the beach in Kauai. Let's go snorkeling together, get some sun, play smash ball, read a book. Everybody would laugh. And yet the consistent biblical account is that Jesus appeared to groups. Others will say, well, maybe the disciples did steal the body. Well, first off, I'm not sure how they would get by the guards. They're mostly fishermen. But second, why on earth would the apostles go steal the body? Because this would mean that they knew the story of the resurrection was false, and then go intentionally propagate a lie to get themselves beaten, thrown in prison, and some of them even killed for their faith. This makes zero sense to me. See, one of my good friends, you might recognize the name J. Warner Wallace. He's a cold case detective. Hardcore atheist till he was 35. Was invited to Saddleback Church, heard Rick Warren present the gospel, and thought, you know what? I'm going to go study the Gospel of Mark using forensic analysis. By the way, he's never lost a case. And you see him on Nightline and Dateline all the time. Brilliant forensic scientist. He goes, I'm going to use forensic analysis to examine the Gospel of Mark. Comes to the conclusion that it's true. Before he even understood why Jesus had to die. He didn't understand the story. I've talked to him. He said, Sean, in every case I've done, people lie and make up stories for one of three reasons: sex and lust, money and greed, or power. Sex, money, power. Every crime. He goes, let's look at the apostles. Were they inventing this story for sex and lust? Of course not. Jesus was single, by the way, and he showed nothing but dignity and respect towards women. What about money? Jesus died with the clothes on his back. He told the rich young ruler, sell everything. It's not about kingdom in this world, it's about kingdom in the next. What about power? Jesus said, if you want to gain your life, you have to lose it. Wash one another's feet. Be a servant. The message of Jesus contradicts everything about the powers of this world that be. Friends, I can't conclude that the apostles made this story up. It makes no sense. Jesus lived. He died. He was buried in Joseph's tomb. This tomb is empty. And you have all these people saying that Jesus appeared to them. So the question is, then why don't more people believe? You know, Pastor Martin mentioned my father, Josh McDowell, spoken here a few times. And my dad, I'm sure you know some of his story. He set out to disprove Christianity in the 1950s because of a challenge by some of his classmates. He thought it was a joke. Now, the background of my dad's story was sexual abuse for 7 years by someone who worked on the farm until he was old enough to slam against a wall and say, if you touch me again, I'll kill you. He had an older sister who committed suicide, and my grandpa, my dad's dad, was a drunk his entire life. My dad had a pretty messed up background. Was challenged to consider the claims of Christ, and he did it because he saw something different in the lives of these believers. So he set out to prove Christianity is false. Traveled around the world, went to Europe and the Middle East, museums, libraries, talked to scholars, etc. after studying this for a long time, kind of concluded, if he's honest with himself, that this is probably true. And he ended up becoming a Christian. And he wrote a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict, probably maybe 15 or 20 years after this. Sold millions of copies. World Magazine called it one of the top 40 books of the 20th century. This is based on research in the 1950s. Not this fall, but fall 2017, I had a chance to update this with my father with 36 grad students and 12 scholars looking at the evidence for Christianity. And once we were done with the book, I said, Dad, how would you assess the amount of evidence now versus the amount of evidence like in the 50s when he set out to disprove this? Now, I don't know how well you know my dad, but he doesn't understate anything, just for the record. He goes, son, there's a tsunami of evidence. I said, what do you mean? He goes, the amount of evidence to convince me was significant in the 50s, but manuscript discoveries, archaeological finds, there is so much evidence for those, like the Gospel of Mark says, with eyes to see and with ears to hear. But my dad's problem was, when he came convinced it was true, he didn't want to believe it for fear of what his friends might say. See, it's not just about the evidence. It's about our pride. It's about our sin. Because the resurrection says you actually have to be willing to pick up your cross and die to yourself. You only find life when you lose it. And that's offensive to the Greeks, and it's a stumbling block to the Jews, and it's especially offensive to our modern mindset that says just be true to yourself. If it feels good, it must be right. I was speaking in Colorado at this ministry. If you're 16 to 25, you have to go to something called Summit. It's the single best worldview apologetic training on the planet, 2 weeks long, best investment if you have kids or grandkids that age. I teach there. My father teaches there. And I was speaking there summer before last, and the student came up to me after a session I did. And he goes, hey, can we talk? I was like, well, you got another session. He goes, I'm an atheist. I said, okay, then let's talk. His parents had sent him to this as an atheist. And we went outside in front of this old hotel, and he starts asking me these apologetic questions about Hinduism being older than Christianity. And I remember sitting there listening to this kid thinking, I just have a hard time believing these are really the issues this kid is struggling with. Like, I've done this enough to think, I just don't buy it. So I said to him, I said, look, I'm happy to try to answer your questions as long as I can. But I sense something else is going on. What's the heart of the issue for you? And I'll never forget what he said. He goes, you're right. It's not just all these questions. He goes, look, I grew up in a Christian home. Just graduated from high school. In the fall, I'm going to a public university, and I just signed up for a fraternity. He said, I just want to have fun for a season in my life. And I looked at him, I said, now you're talking. Now you're being honest. It's not about truth. It's about what you think is the good life, and Christianity is keeping you back from fun things that you want to do. And we had a whole separate conversation. You see, here's the reality of what it is. It's not about just the evidence. Are you ready? The heart of the problem is the problem of the heart. The heart of the problem is the problem of the heart. And Christianity says that you and I are deeply sinful. We can't save ourselves. You can't pull your own bootstraps up and work hard enough. You're broken. And I'm broken. And it's only when we believe in Jesus, who has paid a price for us, that we can be fixed. That's offensive. It's offensive. But in one sense, the Christian message is offensive. But on the flip side, I think it actually resonates with the deepest desires we have as human beings. What do I mean by this? Remember at the beginning we talked about how birth and death and rebirth kind of follows the cycles and the seasons. You know what C.S. Lewis said? He said, actually, when you look in the great literature throughout the history of the world, there's this sense that people believe in these gods who die on behalf of others and kind of rise from this state. He said, in a vague sense, it's as if God has placed on our hearts that the greatest story, humans crave for somebody, a hero, willing to sacrifice their life for somebody else. It's like we resonate with this because we're human. Don't believe me? How many of you have seen the recent movie Infinity War by the Avengers? Let me see your hands. I'm curious. I'm not judging you, just so I understand. Okay, the rest of you, get with it. It's a good movie. Now, anytime I watch a movie, I'm always asking, what's the moral question at the heart of this movie? Do you know, and by the way, realize, in case you haven't followed this movie was 10 years in the making. It started with Captain America 1 and Iron Man and Hulk and all these movies, climaxing in Infinity War, and because they wanted more money, they made it a 2-part series like the Hunger Games did, which will be Endgame, come out in April. 10 years. As many actors as probably in any movie, probably as expensive as any movie, probably the most time. So essentially with Infinity War and the one coming up, the makers are trying to tell the most epic film that you can tell. The greatest clash of heroes who conquer the greatest villain. That's what they're trying to do. So I'm watching this, I'm thinking, what's the moral question at the heart of this? You know what the moral question is? Really the question is, what is true love? Is true love laying down somebody else's life, or is it laying down your own? Who or what would you sacrifice for? That's at the heart of it. So the movie begins with Thor, one of the Avengers. He's held prisoner by Thanos, the ultimate bad guy. And Loki, the brother of Thor, has the option. Thanos says, give me the Infinity Stone, which will make Thanos, the bad guy, more powerful. If you don't, I'll kill your brother. So Loki's like, do I sacrifice his life to let the bad guy get stronger? When is it okay to sacrifice another life? Skip forward. Then you have Star-Lord, played by Chris Pratt, who my 11-year-old thinks is so cute. 11-year-old girl thinks he's so cute. And we'll leave it at that. Chris Pratt plays a character by the name of Star-Lord. And he likes this other character by the name of Gamora. And Gamora says, if Thanos gets me, he's going to use me to get another Infinity Stone. If he has me, I need you to shoot me and take my life. So there's a scene where he sees Thanos has her, and he's like, do I actually kill her now and sacrifice her life for this greater cause? Another scene in the movie, another of the Avengers is named Vision. He has one of the Infinity Stones right here. And his girlfriend or lover or whatever is the name of Scarlet Witch. And he starts to realize that Thanos needs the Infinity Stone, but if they remove the Infinity Stone, he's going to die. So eventually he says, I will lay down my life to destroy the Infinity Stone, to protect Thanos from destroying the universe. Another scene in the movie. There's an issue with Iron Man and Doctor Strange and Thanos. Will Doctor Strange give him the Infinity Stone or allow Thanos to kill Iron Man? Do you see the question wedded through this entire movie? It's brilliant. When is it okay to sacrifice a human life? Now, the scene that got me and I paused was when, if you haven't seen the movie, just bear with me, is Spider-Man and this whole group of people almost have the glove off Thanos, and if they get it off, they win. But Chris Pratt, Star-Lord, realizes that Thanos had taken Gamora and sacrificed her so he could get a stone. And do you know what the character says? He says to Thanos, he goes, this is not real love. In other words, the bad guy is willing to sacrifice other people for his own gain. But Captain America says, we are not in the business of exchanging lives until it comes to the point where there's nothing left to do, where vision says, I lay down my own life to save the rest. Do you notice a theme here? Arguably the most epic movie ever told, and at the heart of it is the gospel. It is. They're asking the question, what is true love, and how do we save people? That's the question. Jesus said, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for a friend. We know the greatest sacrifice we can make, because it's giving the most we have, is to lay down our life. And then what makes it greater is when somebody lays down their life and they come back from the dead. Think about it. That's in the movie Matrix with Neo. It's the end of Avatar with Jake Sully, and it's the end of the Harry Potter series. It is. It's all over fictional stories. Because if we want to tell the greatest story, it's not only written in our seasons about death and life and reburial, it's written on the human heart. So Infinity War is a story that illustrates this. So is The Matrix. So is Avatar. So are the great stories throughout human history. And you know what? So is Christianity, but there's one difference. It's the true story. And when we know it's true, friends, it changes everything. It changes everything. I'll give you one example and I'll end. Look, a friend of mine, one of my favorite preachers to listen to, was telling a story about when he learned that his father had died. His mother called him the next morning and he goes, son, your father passed away. Gathered himself, he said, what happened? He said, last night, your father sat up in bed. And he was older. He kind of looked up. And he cited a passage from 1 Corinthians 15 that's all about resurrection. He looked up in the heavens, he said, death, where's your victory? Death, where's your sting? Death, where's your victory? Death, where's your sting? Said it 3 times, laid back down in bed, and breathed his last. When I heard that, I said, that's how I want to go. Because he understood that this world, as we look outside, it might feel like, winter and rain is going a lot longer than normal, and it starts to even affect us psychologically, at least people who are conditioned this way like we are in California. You also might be in a season in your life, you feel like, man, it feels like God is silent, and I'm suffering. And why doesn't God act? Why doesn't God speak? And the reality is, Jesus has already risen from the grave. We're already on the winning side of history. The question is, are we going to believe it, and are we going to claim it and live in light of that? Because the seeming darkest moment for the apostles is when Jesus arrested and killed, and they said, we thought he was the one. The irony is, that's when God was doing his greatest deeds. Friends, sometimes winter seems long, metaphorically and in real life. But we've already won. Jesus has risen from the grave. So as you look at the rain keeps coming down and you look at your phone, remember, say, God, thank you for the season. Thank you for the rain. But I know that spring is coming. And second, if you like superheroes or you don't, when that movie comes out next, ask yourself, what's the moral question behind it? And which superhero is going to die? Let me tell you right now, it's going to be Captain America. He has to die because his whole character arc is a willingness to sacrifice for others. He has to if they're going to be consistent. Because if you want to be the greatest hero, you have to be willing to lay down your life. And that's exactly what Jesus did. Not in a comic book, not in a movie, 2,000 years ago.